Commander Thane Harrison stared out the viewport of the diplomatic vessel Horizon's Edge and wondered, not for the first time, how exactly he'd managed to talk himself into what was essentially a suicide mission with better catering. The Felinar homeworld hung before them like a jewel made of amber and steel, its cities gleaming against land masses that looked like they'd been carved by claws the size of starships, which, knowing the Felinar, they probably had been. "Remind me again why we volunteered for this," he muttered, adjusting his dress uniform for the 100th time. The thing felt like a straitjacket designed by someone who'd never actually met a human before. Dr. Cora Haynes looked up from her datapad, where she'd been frantically reviewing everything humanity knew about Felinar culture, which could generously be described as absolutely nothing useful. She pushed a strand of auburn hair behind her ear and gave him that look, the one that said she was about to deliver news he really didn't want to hear. "Because, Commander, we're the newest kids on the Galactic playground, and apparently drawing the short straw for impossible diplomatic missions is some sort of hazing ritual." She gestured at her screen, which displayed a rather unflattering diplomatic record. The Altarians lasted exactly 18 minutes before their ambassador started crying. The Zephyrians made it to the landing pad before turning around and declaring the Felinar incompatible with civilized discourse. And don't get me started on what happened to the Crystalline Consortium's delegation. What happened to them? Nobody knows. They just left very quickly, without filing a report or speaking to anyone ever again. Ben Foster, their cultural attaché and the only member of their team who still seemed optimistic about their chances, bounded over with the kind of enthusiasm that usually preceded spectacular disasters. His dark eyes sparkled with the kind of academic fervor that made seasoned diplomats break out in cold sweats. "But that's exactly why we're going to succeed," he announced, clutching his own datapad like a shield against reality. "Every other species has approached the Felinar with preconceived notions about predator cultures. We're going in fresh, with open minds and genuine curiosity about their society." Thane and Cora exchanged a look that roughly translated to, "Someone's going to die today, and it's probably going to be Ben." The ship's intercom crackled to life. "Attention diplomatic party. We've received clearance to land. Please prepare for surface operations and try not to do anything that starts an interspecies war." "Comforting," Thane muttered, checking his sidearm out of habit before remembering that bringing weapons to a first contact with apex predators was generally considered poor form. The diplomatic corps had been very clear about that, right after they'd been very clear about humanity's desperate need to make a good impression somewhere, anywhere, in the galactic community. The descent through Felinar atmosphere was smooth enough, but Thane couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Not just tracked by sensors, actively watched, the way a cat watches a mouse that hasn't quite realized it's already been caught. The landing pad they approached was carved from what looked like a single piece of black stone, surrounded by architecture that seemed to flow like frozen water while somehow still looking like it could tear you apart just by existing. "Readings indicate approximately 20 life forms waiting for us," the pilot announced over the intercom. "All of them are, well, they're big, really big, and they appear to be armed with what our computers are politely calling edged implements of significant size. Weapons," Cora translated helpfully. "Very large weapons," Ben added, his enthusiasm dimming just slightly. The airlock cycled, and the first thing that hit them wasn't the sight of the Felinar delegation. It was the sound. A low, rumbling vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once, like standing inside the world's largest purring engine. It raised every hair on Thane's arms and made his hindbrain start screaming suggestions about running very, very fast in the opposite direction. Then he saw them. If someone had taken the concept of large predatory cat, fed it a steady diet of protein powder and intimidation, then scaled it up to roughly 8 feet tall and given it opposable thumbs, they might have come close to approximating a Felinar. Might have. The reality was somehow both more graceful and more terrifying than any briefing could have conveyed. Their leader, and there was no question who was in charge, stood at the front of the group like a monument to the concept of apex predator. High Matriarch Yera Seth was a creature of golden fur, marked with stripes of deepest black, her amber eyes reflecting an intelligence that made Thane uncomfortably aware of exactly how fragile humans really were. She wore what appeared to be ceremonial armor that looked like it had been forged from starlight and bad intentions, and when she moved, it was with the kind of fluid grace that suggested she could probably remove his head before he finished blinking. "Humans," she said, and somehow made their species name sound like something you'd scrape off your shoe. Her voice carried that same rumbling undertone, but shaped into words that felt like they were being carved directly into the air. "You are smaller than expected." Ben stepped forward with a diplomat's smile that was probably supposed to be reassuring, but mostly just made him look like he was about to apologize for existing. "High Matriarch Yera Seth, we are honored by your willingness to meet with us. I am Ben Foster, Cultural Attaché for the Human Diplomatic Corps. This is Dr. Cora Haynes, our xenobiologist, and Commander Thane Harrison, our mission leader." Yera Seth's gaze swept over them with the kind of assessment that usually preceded either mating or being eaten, and Thane was fairly certain they weren't being considered for the first option. Her warriors, and there was no other word for the beings flanking her, shifted restlessly, their own eyes reflecting that same predatory calculation. "Cultural attaché," she repeated, pronouncing each syllable like she was tasting something unpleasant. "Xenobiologist, commander." She paused, and Thane had the distinct impression she was filing them under things that might be amusing to play with before disposal. "We understand this is humanity's first formal contact with your people," Cora said, stepping forward with the kind of scientific enthusiasm that had probably gotten her into trouble before. "We're very interested in learning about Felinar culture and traditions." A sound rippled through the assembled Felinar that might have been laughter, if laughter was something that could kill small animals at 20 paces. Yera Seth's ears twitched forward, which, according to Ben's hurried research, was either a sign of interest or a precursor to pouncing. "Interested," she mused. "Yes, many species have been interested in our ways. The Altarians were interested. The Zephyrians were interested. The Crystalline Consortium was very interested indeed." The way she said it made Thane's hand twitch toward where his sidearm should have been. "And how did those meetings conclude?" Yera Seth's expression shifted into what might have been a smile, if smiles usually involved that many teeth. "Quickly." The silence that followed was the kind that made diplomatic careers die quiet, whimpering deaths. Thane found himself calculating distances to the ship, wondering if they could make it back to the airlock before being overtaken by creatures that probably considered chasing down fleeing prey a form of light exercise. "We had hoped," Ben said, his voice only slightly higher than usual, "to establish a more lasting relationship between our peoples." Relationship. Yera Seth rolled the word around like she was examining it for defects. What manner of relationship does humanity seek with the Felinar? It was a simple question. It was also, Thane realized, probably the most important question anyone had ever asked him. The wrong answer wouldn't just end their diplomatic mission, it would probably end their diplomatic careers, and possibly their lives. No pressure at all. "Mutual respect," he said finally, because sometimes the truth was the only option left. "Understanding. Maybe eventually friendship, if we prove worthy of it." The sound that came from the assembled Felinar was definitely not laughter this time. It was something lower, more thoughtful, and somehow infinitely more dangerous. Yera Seth took a step closer, and Thane fought every instinct he had that was screaming at him to take a step back. "Worthy," she said softly. An interesting choice of words. "Commander Thane Harrison." She pronounced his name with the kind of precision that suggested she'd already decided whether or not he deserved to keep it. "Tell me, what makes humanity believe it could ever be worthy of Felinar trust?" And there it was, the question that every other species had apparently failed to answer correctly. Thane looked into those amber eyes and realized that this wasn't just a diplomatic meeting. This was a test, and humanity was about to find out whether they'd studied for the right exam. The problem was, he had absolutely no idea what the right answer was supposed to be. Thane was still trying to formulate an answer that wouldn't get them all killed when the universe decided to throw him a curveball wrapped in chaos and tied with a bow made of pure panic. The sound came first, a high, keening wail that cut through the low rumble of Felinar voices like a blade through silk. Every warrior in the courtyard went rigid, their ears snapping to attention with the kind of focus that suggested something very important was happening. Euryseth's head whipped toward the source of the sound, and for the first time since they'd met her, she looked concerned. That was when a young Felinar came sprinting into the courtyard like their tail was on fire, clutching something against their chest with the kind of desperate care usually reserved for handling live explosives. The runner was smaller than the warriors, with fur that was more silver than gold, and they were moving with the fluid panic of someone who knew they were about to interrupt something monumentally important but had no choice in the matter. They skidded to a halt in front of Euryseth and immediately began speaking in rapid, musical Felinar that sounded like a cross between purring and singing. Whatever they were saying, it had an immediate effect on the assembled warriors. The low rumbling that had been their background soundtrack since landing shifted to something higher, more urgent. The sound of a pride responding to crisis. Euryseth's response was swift and sharp, but her attention was clearly focused on whatever the young Felinar was carrying. She held out her hands, and the runner carefully transferred their burden into her arms. That was when Thane saw what all the fuss was about. It was small, impossibly, ridiculously small. Maybe the size of a house cat, if house cats came equipped with tiny fangs and miniature claws and the kind of indignant expression that suggested they were personally offended by the entire concept of existence. The cub, because that's obviously what it was covered in the softest-looking fur Thane had ever seen, a pale gold that seemed to shimmer in the light. Its eyes were still closed, the way newborn mammals' eyes usually were, but it was making sounds that could have melted the heart of a tax collector. Euryseth cradled the tiny creature with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone who'd been intimidating them just moments before. The transformation was startling. The apex predator had been replaced by something that looked suspiciously like a worried grandmother. "High Matriarch," Ben ventured, his diplomatic training apparently including a course in how to politely inquire about cute baby animals during tense negotiations. Euryseth looked up, and for a moment, her expression was unguarded, vulnerable. It was the kind of look that said everything about the situation had just changed, and nobody was quite sure what the new rules were going to be. "My grandcub," she said simply, and those two words carried more weight than entire diplomatic treaties. "Orphaned 3 days ago. The parents were lost in an accident during a hunting expedition." The silence that followed was different from the earlier tension. This was the silence of people, beings, confronting something larger than politics or territory or species differences. This was about family and loss, and the kind of responsibility that didn't care about your diplomatic agenda. Cora took a half-step forward, her scientific curiosity warring with common sense. "How old?" 4 days, Euryseth replied, her voice carrying the kind of exhaustion that suggested she'd been up for most of those 4 days. "Cubs must be named before their first weekends, or—" She trailed off, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. "Or what?" Thane asked, because sometimes being direct was the only way through a conversation. "Or they cannot be accepted into the pride. They become outcasts, alone." The way she said it made clear that for a species like the Felinar, being alone was essentially a death sentence. Ben was frantically tapping on his datapad, probably trying to access whatever databases humanity had on Felinar naming customs. His expression suggested he wasn't finding much that was helpful, which was about par for the course when it came to their preparation for this mission. The naming ceremony requires someone who has earned the absolute trust of the pride, Euryseth continued. And suddenly Thane understood why their earlier question about worthiness had been so loaded. Someone who the pack considers family. Someone who would protect the cub with their own life. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and the picture they were forming was either brilliant or terrifying. Possibly both. In all of Felinar history, she said, her amber eyes fixed on the tiny bundle in her arms, no outsider has ever been granted this honor. No other species has ever earned our trust to this degree. But you've been testing them, Cora said, her scientist's mind putting together patterns that diplomats had missed. All those failed first contacts. You weren't just meeting with them, you were evaluating them. Yiraseth's ears twitched in what might have been approval. The Altarians spoke of conquest through commerce. The Zephyrians sought to catalog us like specimens. The crystalline consortium ... Her expression darkened. They asked how our cubs might be acquired for study. Thane felt something cold settle in his stomach. And they left quickly after that. They left while they still could, she confirmed, and there was nothing pleasant in her tone. The cub in her arms made a small sound. Not the earlier wailing, but something softer, more questioning. It was the kind of sound that bypassed rational thought and went straight to whatever part of the brain was responsible for wanting to protect small, helpless things. So what happens now? Thane asked, because someone had to voice what they were all thinking. Yiraseth looked at him for a long moment, and he had the distinct impression he was being weighed on scales he couldn't see. Now, Commander Thane Harrison, you answer the question I asked you. What makes humanity believe it could ever be worthy of Felinar trust? But before he could respond, the cub made another sound, this one clearly distressed, and began to wriggle in Yiraseth's arms. She tried to soothe it, making soft clicking sounds, but the little creature was having none of it. Its cries grew louder, more insistent, and Thane could see the worry deepening in the matriarch's eyes. It hasn't eaten properly since, she began, then stopped, clearly not wanting to finish that sentence. Since the parents died, Cora supplied gently. Cubs this young require constant care, feeding every few hours, warmth, the sound of a heartbeat. Yiraseth's voice was tight with controlled emotion. I am too old. My scent too different. The others try, but... The cub's wails were getting stronger, more desperate, and Thane found himself taking a step forward without consciously deciding to do so. Something about the sound was triggering every protective instinct he had, which was weird because he'd never considered himself particularly good with babies of any species. May I? He asked, holding out his hands. The request surprised everyone, including himself. Yiraseth's eyes widened, and several of the warriors made sounds that were probably protests, but the matriarch studied his face for a moment, then carefully placed the tiny cub in his arms. The effect was immediate and startling. The moment the cub settled against Thane's chest, its cries began to quiet. It nuzzled closer to the sound of his heartbeat, making small, contented sounds that were almost like purring. Well, Ben said faintly, that's unexpected. Yiraseth was staring at them both with an expression Thane couldn't quite read. In 4 days, only you have been able to calm it. Maybe it's the body temperature difference, Cora suggested, but her voice sounded doubtful. Humans run warmer than most species. No, Yiraseth said softly, and there was something like wonder in her voice. It is not temperature. It is recognition. The cub had settled completely now, one tiny paw resting against Thane's chest, its breathing steady and peaceful. Looking down at it, Thane felt something shift inside him, some fundamental change in the way he understood what was happening here. The cub chooses, Yiraseth said, and her voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. It has chosen you, Commander Thane Harrison. The question now is, will you choose it? And suddenly, Thane realized that this wasn't just about diplomacy anymore. This wasn't about humanity proving itself worthy of galactic respect or earning a place at the big kids' table of interstellar politics. This was about a tiny, orphaned creature who had somehow decided that a gruff human soldier was the safest place in the universe. The question was, what was he going to do about it? Standing in the middle of an alien courtyard, holding what was essentially a furry grenade with trust issues, Thane had what could generously be called an epiphany. Less generously, it could be called a moment of complete panic, disguised as enlightenment. The cub, he really needed to stop thinking of it as the cub and start thinking of it as someone who was apparently his responsibility now, shifted slightly in his arms, making a small sound that was probably contentment, but could just as easily have been plotting. Either way, the sound seemed to ripple through the assembled Felinar like a stone dropped in still water. Yiraseth was watching him with the kind of intensity usually reserved for watching bomb defusal experts, and Thane had the uncomfortable realization that he was essentially holding the fate of human Felinar relations in his arms. No pressure at all. The naming ceremony, he said, because someone had to address the elephant in the room, or in this case, the tiny apex predator in his arms. What exactly does it involve? The question sparked what appeared to be a heated discussion among the Felinar warriors. They spoke in rapid musical tones that rose and fell like a song, but a song that was probably about whether or not to trust a human with their most sacred traditions. Ben was frantically taking notes, though Thane suspected bunch of large cat people having an argument about whether to let the human name their baby wasn't going to be particularly useful for future diplomatic reference. Yiraseth raised one hand, and the discussion immediately stopped. The authority in that simple gesture was absolute. This was clearly a being who was used to being obeyed without question. The ceremony has not been performed for an outsider in over 1,000 years, she said, her voice carrying the weight of history. There are complications. What kind of complications? Cora asked, because apparently her scientific curiosity was stronger than her sense of self-preservation. If the name is rejected by the cub or deemed unworthy by the spirits of our ancestors, as interpreted by the pack's reaction, then the cub becomes forever outcast, and the one who attempted the naming. She paused, and Thane really didn't like the way that pause felt. They too become cast out, from all Felinar space, permanently. Ah, Ben said faintly. That's quite a consequence. It gets better, Yiraseth continued, and Thane was starting to understand that when apex predators said things got better, they usually meant the exact opposite. If a non-Felinar attempts the ceremony and fails, it is considered an act of spiritual violence against the entire species. Diplomatic relations become impossible, forever. The silence that followed was the kind that made careers die quiet, whimpering deaths while filling out unemployment paperwork. Thane looked down at the small bundle in his arms, who chose that moment to open one tiny eye and fix it on his face with the kind of direct stare that suggested this whole situation was somehow his fault. So let me get this straight, he said slowly. If I try this and get it wrong, not only does the cub become an outcast, but humanity gets permanently banned from Felinar space, and I personally become the guy who ruined first contact with an entire species. That is accurate, Yiraseth confirmed. And if I don't try it, the cub becomes outcast anyway, and we will know that humanity, like all the others, was not worthy of our trust. Thane looked around at his companions. Ben had gone slightly green around the edges and was clutching his datapad like a life preserver. Cora was staring at him with the kind of expression that suggested she was already composing the scientific paper about how humanity had managed to spectacularly fail at interspecies relations within the first 20 minutes of trying. How long do we have to decide? He asked. The ceremony must be completed before sunset, Yiraseth said, glancing at the sky where the Felinar sun was already beginning its descent toward the horizon. That gives us perhaps 2 hours. 2 hours to either make history or become a cautionary tale that would be told in diplomatic academies for the next century. Thane had faced worse odds, though admittedly not while holding a baby. The cub made another small sound and settled more deeply into his arms, apparently deciding that whatever was happening, Thane was the safest place to be while it happened. The trust implicit in that simple action hit him harder than he'd expected. "What does the naming ceremony actually involve?" he asked. "I mean, what am I supposed to do?" Uraseth exchanged glances with her warriors, and another rapid conversation in Felinar followed. This one seemed less heated and more instructional. When it ended, she turned back to him with an expression that might have been approval. "First, the pack forms a circle around the name-giver and the cub. We sing the songs of our ancestors, calling upon their wisdom to guide the choice. Then," she paused, studying his face, "then you must speak the name you have chosen, clearly and with conviction. But, Commander, the name cannot be chosen from knowledge. It must come from understanding, from connection, from the heart, not the mind." Ben looked up from his datapad with the expression of someone who had just realized all his research was useless. "But surely there must be traditional naming patterns, common elements, something we can use as a guide. If you attempt to name the cub according to patterns and traditions you have memorized," Uraseth said, and her tone suggested this was very important, "you will fail. The spirits know authenticity from performance. The cub knows love from duty." "Love," Cora repeated softly, and something in her voice suggested she was beginning to understand what this was really about. "The Felinar do not merely name their cubs," Uraseth explained. "We call forth their true selves. We speak into existence who they are meant to become. It is an act of profound faith, faith that the name-giver truly sees the cub's spirit, truly understands their potential." Thane looked down at the small creature in his arms, who had now opened both eyes and was regarding him with a kind of solemn attention that made him feel like he was being evaluated for a job he wasn't sure he was qualified for. The eyes were a deep amber, like liquid gold, and there was something in them that seemed far too old for something that had only been alive for 4 days. "How am I supposed to understand the spirit of someone I just met?" he asked. "The same way the cub understood yours," Uraseth replied. "Without words, without thought, through recognition of something deeper than knowledge." The warriors began to move, forming a large circle around them with the kind of fluid coordination that suggested this was a dance they all knew by heart. Their movements were graceful, purposeful, and somehow deeply solemn. This wasn't just a ceremony. It was a sacred act that connected the present moment to countless generations of Felinar history. As they settled into their positions, they began to sing. It wasn't like any music Thane had ever heard. It was deeper, more primal, rising and falling in harmonies that seemed to come from the planet itself. The sound surrounded them, filling the courtyard with something that felt ancient and powerful and profoundly moving. The cub responded immediately, making small sounds that almost seemed to harmonize with the singing. Its tiny body relaxed even further into Thane's arms, and he could feel the vibration of its purr against his chest. "The ancestors are listening," Uraseth said, her voice somehow audible above the singing. "They will know if your heart is true." Thane closed his eyes and tried to quiet his mind, to stop thinking about diplomatic consequences and career implications, and the fact that he was about to either make history or become the punchline to a very expensive joke. Instead, he focused on the small weight in his arms, on the trust implicit in the way the cub had settled against him, on the fierce determination to survive that had carried this tiny being through 4 days of uncertainty and loss. When he opened his eyes again, he knew what the name had to be. It wasn't a name from any database or cultural guide. It wasn't chosen according to Felinar traditions or human customs. It was simply the word that felt right, that captured something essential about the small, brave creature who had chosen to trust him. The singing reached a crescendo and then slowly faded. leaving the courtyard in a silence that felt expectant, sacred. Every eye was on him, every breath held in anticipation. The moment stretched like a held breath, and Thane found himself thinking about all the paths that had led to this impossible moment. 3 weeks ago, he'd been filling out requisition forms and wondering if he'd ever see real action again. 2 weeks ago, he'd been sitting in a briefing room learning about humanity's desperate need to make friends in a galaxy that seemed determined to treat them like the awkward new kids in school. 1 week ago, he'd been packing for what everyone assumed would be a polite but ultimately meaningless diplomatic mission. Now he was standing on an alien world, holding a creature that might as well have been made of starlight and stubbornness, about to speak a name that would either bridge 2 species or end any hope of cooperation between them forever. The weight of responsibility should have been crushing. Instead, looking down at the small face that was watching him with such complete trust, Thane felt something he hadn't experienced in years: absolute certainty. Not about the consequences, not about the politics, not about what would happen next, but about this moment, this choice, this name that felt as inevitable as gravity. "The ancestors grow impatient," one of the warriors murmured, though not unkindly. "The sun moves toward the horizon." Euryseth shot the speaker a look that could have frozen plasma, but Thane understood. Time was running out, and ceremony or no ceremony, the cub needed a name before sunset. Biology didn't care about the dramatic tension of the moment. "I need to tell you something," he said to the cub, his voice quiet but clear enough for the assembled Felinar to hear. "I don't know much about being responsible for someone else. I've spent most of my career being responsible for missions and objectives and strategic outcomes, things that could be measured and quantified and put in reports." The cub made a small sound that might have been encouragement. Or gas. It was hard to tell with newborns. "But looking at you," Thane continued, "I understand something I didn't before. You're not a mission objective. You're not a diplomatic opportunity. You're just you. Someone who's already survived more than anyone should have to in 4 days of life. Someone who's brave enough to trust a stranger from another species. Someone who deserves better than to be caught up in politics and species relations and all the complicated nonsense that adults use to make simple things difficult." The singing had stopped entirely now, and the only sounds in the courtyard were the whisper of wind through alien architecture and the steady rhythm of the cub's breathing. Even Ben had stopped taking notes, his stylus frozen above his datapad as he watched the scene unfold. "You deserve a name that means something," Thane said. "Not something chosen because it sounds impressive or follows tradition or checks the right boxes on some cultural compatibility chart. Something that recognizes who you already are." He lifted the cub slightly, meeting those amber eyes directly. "You've shown more courage in 4 days than most beings show in a lifetime. You've faced loss and uncertainty and a world that suddenly became much bigger and scarier than it should be for someone your size. And instead of giving up, instead of just fading away, you chose to keep fighting. You chose to trust. You chose to hope that someone would see you as worth protecting." The cub's purr deepened, a sound like distant thunder made of contentment. "So your name isn't about what I hope you'll become," Thane said. "It's about what you already are." He looked up, meeting Euryseth's eyes, then letting his gaze sweep across the assembled warriors who had trusted him with their most sacred ceremony. Thane looked down at the cub, who was watching him with those ancient amber eyes, and spoke the name that had formed in his heart. "Honor," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "Your name is Honor." The silence that followed Thane's pronouncement was the kind that made universes hold their breath. For a moment that stretched like eternity, nothing moved in the courtyard except the gentle rise and fall of Honor's breathing against his chest. The assembled Felinar warriors stood frozen, their amber eyes fixed on the small bundle in his arms with an intensity that could have melted steel. Then Honor made a sound. It wasn't the distressed wailing from earlier, or even the contented purring that had become familiar. This was something entirely new. A small, melodic trill that seemed to bubble up from somewhere deep in the cub's chest. It was a sound of pure joy, of recognition, of absolute certainty that this was exactly right. The effect on the assembled Felinar was immediate and startling. The silence shattered like glass as every warrior in the circle began to rumble. Not the threatening sound from their arrival, but something deeper, richer, more musical. It was harmony in its most primal form, voices joining together in a sound that spoke of acceptance, approval, and something that felt remarkably like celebration. Yiraseth's expression transformed completely. The stern, intimidating matriarch was replaced by someone who looked suspiciously like she was fighting back tears. Her own voice joined the chorus, adding a deeper note that seemed to anchor all the others. "The ancestors have spoken," she said, when the rumbling finally subsided, and her voice carried a wonder that made it clear this wasn't the outcome she'd expected. "They have accepted the name. They have accepted the name-giver. Honor, and it was definitely honor now, not the cub." Shifted in Thane's arms and opened both eyes fully for the first time, fixing that ancient amber gaze on his face. There was something different about the look now, something that suggested recognition went both ways. "Well?" Ben said faintly, lowering his datapad with the expression of someone whose worldview had just been thoroughly rearranged. That went better than expected." "Better than expected?" Cora laughed, and there was something almost hysterical in the sound. "Thane, do you have any idea what just happened?" "I named a cub," he offered, though he suspected that was probably understating things by several orders of magnitude. Yiraseth stepped forward, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of ceremony. "You have done far more than that, Commander Thane Harrison. You have become Pack. You have become family. You have become Honor's chosen guardian in the eyes of our ancestors and our people." The implications of that statement were still sinking in when she continued. "But more than that, you have proven something that no other species has been able to prove in over 1,000 years of contact attempts. You have shown that it is possible for a non-Felinar to truly see one of our own, to understand not just our customs or our politics, but our hearts." One of the warriors, a massive individual whose fur was marked with the kind of scars that suggested a lifetime of serious combat, stepped forward and spoke in rapid Felinar. Yiraseth listened, then nodded solemnly. "Battle Singer Gorath wishes to know if you understand what this means for the relationship between our species," she translated. "I'm hoping it means something good," Thane said, because diplomacy had never really been his strong suit, and he was pretty much flying blind at this point. "It means," Yiraseth said, and there was something that might have been amusement in her voice, "that humanity has achieved something unprecedented. You have not merely earned our respect or our willingness to negotiate. You have earned our trust, our pack bond, our family loyalty." The full weight of that statement hit him like a physical blow. Family loyalty. For a species like the Felinar, that wasn't just a diplomatic nicety. It was everything. It was the foundation of their entire social structure, their approach to conflict, their understanding of the universe itself. "Does this mean," Ben asked carefully, "that we can proceed with formal diplomatic negotiations?" The sound that came from the assembled Felinar was definitely laughter this time. Warm, genuine amusement that suggested Ben had just asked something charmingly naive. "Negotiations," Yiraseth repeated. "Child, there will be no negotiations. Family does not negotiate with family. Family supports family. Family protects family. Family stands together against all threats." She gestured to the warriors around them, who were beginning to disperse, but doing so with the relaxed posture of people whose most important business had been successfully concluded. "Word will spread throughout Felinar space within hours. Every pack, every clan, every world will know that the humans have been accepted. That Commander Thane Harrison has been claimed as Pack Brother, and that little honor has chosen him as guardian." Honor chose that moment to make another of those melodic trills, as if commenting on the conversation. The sound made several nearby warriors turn and respond with their own soft rumbles of approval. There will, however, be certain responsibilities, Euryseth continued, and something in her tone suggested Thane's life was about to become significantly more complicated. Honor will need to be raised understanding both human and Felinar ways. They will need to learn the songs of our ancestors and the stories of your people. They will need to know their place in both worlds. Both worlds? Cora asked. Did you think this was merely ceremonial? Euryseth seemed genuinely surprised by the question. Honor is now Thane's responsibility in every sense. Felinar cubs remain with their guardians until they reach maturity. That process takes approximately 15 of your years. The silence that followed was the kind that made diplomatic careers flash before people's eyes. Thane looked down at Honor, who was watching him with the expression of someone who had just successfully rearranged the entire universe to their satisfaction. 15 years, he repeated slowly. During which time, Euryseth continued cheerfully, you will be expected to visit Felinar space regularly so that Honor can maintain connections with their birth pack. And of course, Honor will need to spend time in human space as well, learning your ways. Of course, Thane said faintly. Consider it an extended cultural exchange program, she added. The first of its kind between our species. Ben was frantically taking notes again, muttering something about unprecedented diplomatic frameworks and interspecies guardianship protocols. Cora was staring at Honor with the expression of someone who was already composing research proposals about human Felinar bonding patterns. There is one more thing, Euryseth said, and her tone suggested this was important. The name you chose, Honor. Do you know what it means in our language? I was hoping it meant something good, Thane admitted. It means one who bridges worlds, she said softly. It is a name from our oldest legends, given to those who are destined to bring different peoples together. It has not been spoken as a true name for over 3 centuries. Honor made another pleased sound, as if commenting on their own excellent naming. So either this is the most incredible coincidence in galactic history, Cora said slowly, or ... or the ancestors have been planning this for longer than any of us realized, Euryseth finished. Perhaps they knew that our species needed someone like Honor to help us understand each other. And perhaps they knew that humanity needed someone like Commander Harrison to prove their worthiness of our trust. 6 months later, Thane found himself in his quarters aboard the human diplomatic station orbiting the Felinar homeworld, watching Honor attempt to catch their own tail while simultaneously trying to help with his mission reports. The cub had grown considerably in the intervening months, developing into a small, furry tornado of curiosity and mischief who seemed to view the universe as their personal playground. The political implications of their unusual partnership had been staggering. The Felinar alliance had transformed humanity's position in galactic politics overnight. Other species that had been lukewarm about human membership in the galactic community suddenly found themselves very interested in establishing formal relations. After all, if the notoriously selective Felinar had accepted humanity as family, there had to be something special about these peculiar bipeds. The Quellian delegation wants to schedule a meeting, Cora announced, entering his quarters with the kind of expression that suggested the universe was still finding new ways to complicate his life. Apparently, they're fascinated by humanity's unique approach to interspecies diplomacy. You mean they want to know how we managed to accidentally adopt a Felinar cub and turn it into the most successful first contact in recorded history, Thane translated. That's probably more accurate, she admitted. Honor, who had been attempting to scale Thane's desk, paused in their climbing to fix Cora with an imperious stare. In the months since the naming ceremony, the cub had developed distinct opinions about most people, and Cora ranked somewhere between tolerable and useful for acquiring interesting specimens. Any word from the Felinar Council about the trade agreements? Thane asked. gently disentangling Honor from his paperwork before the cub could decide that official documents were better used as toys. "They're asking if we want exclusive trading rights for the next century." Ben's voice came from the doorway. "I think they're still trying to figure out appropriate ways to show appreciation for family." "A century?" Thane blinked. "That seems excessive." "That's what I said. Uriseth just laughed and said it was a small token of affection, and that we'd understand fell in our gratitude better once Honor started bringing home their first successful hunts." Honor chirped happily at the mention of hunting, despite being far too young to catch anything more dangerous than dust motes. They had, however, successfully hunted 3 of Thane's styluses, 2 datapads, and 1 very confused maintenance bot. "You know," Cora said, settling into a chair and watching Honor attempt to pounce on their own shadow, "when we started this mission, I thought the best possible outcome would be a simple trade agreement and maybe some cultural exchange programs. And instead, we got a family member who's going to reshape interstellar politics for the next generation," Thane said, catching Honor as they launched themselves off the desk in pursuit of what appeared to be an imaginary target. "Think they'll forgive us for accidentally starting a revolution in galactic diplomacy?" Ben asked. Honor looked up at them all and made a sound that could have been agreement, or commentary, or simply the pleased observation that their humans were finally learning to ask the right questions. "I think," Thane said, settling back in his chair with Honor purring contentedly in his lap, "they're going to love every minute of it." And from the way Honor's purr deepened, it was clear that at least one member of their unusual family was already planning their next adventure in bridge building. After all, bringing different worlds together was exactly what they'd been named for.